Hello, everyone. We'll be back in one moment. It's about 1 minute to noon, and I will be very shortly delivering my Drasha, my Dvar Torah for this Shabbat, Parshat Vayeshev, Shabbat Chanukah, 5781 in the year 2020. All right, I will be right back in one moment. Don't go anywhere. All right, I think the lighting is a little better now. And we're gonna try to bring this down and this up. See if I can see everything I need to see on one screen. And all right. Hello, everyone. Chag Urim Sameach. Happy Hanukkah. This week is Parshat Vayeshev, the Shabbat. When we read the story of how Yosef's brothers conspire against him and throw him into a pit. And this is really the Parsha, the first of several Parshiot in which the real star of the show seems to be Yosef. We had a few Parshiot about Avraham Avinu, and then part of a Parsha about Yitzchak, and then we had a couple Parshiot about Yaakov, and now it seems the baton is getting passed to the next generation, and the star of the show is Yosef. And as we from one generation to another, it's worth thinking about the concept of Maraseh Avot Siman Levanim. The deed of the parents is a sign, literally a sign for the children. This idea, articulated by Ramban Nachmanides, it says in effect that in the Torah and in Tanakh, as in the rest of life, children follow in their parents' footsteps. And there's two sides to this. One is the side that Ramban discusses in regards to the Avot, that their actions are a blueprint for later Jewish history. Avraham went down to Egypt, and so the children of Israel are destined to go down to Egypt. Avraham came out with riches, and the children of Israel will come out of Egypt with riches. There's another dimension of Ma'aseh Avot Siman Levanim, which is that something a little more akin to our concept of heredity. That the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. A certain personality should be passed from parents to children in the Torah and in Tanakh. Yosef, in particular, inherits not only his mother's good looks, both of them are described as being beautiful and shapely, but he also inherits her habit of keeping quiet about crucial information. Rachel failed to tell her husband Yaakov, or her future husband Yaakov, that her father was arranging for him to marry her sister instead of her. And later she neglects to mention to him that she stole her father's idols, laying the ground for him to make a disastrous oath that if anyone in his house had taken those idols, they will die, which she very shortly does. And Yosef also keeps quiet about information at crucial moments. Next week, we'll read about how the brothers go down to Egypt, where Yosef has been made the prime minister or chief of staff to Pharaoh, as it were. And Yosef declines to reveal his identity to them. Another example of this kind of heredity is the way Levi's zeal and violent temper are passed along to his descendants. Not only Moshe and Pinchas, who Moshe is famed for his temper, for his anger, and Pinchas famously takes decisive action to violently slay people who are desecrating God's name, but really the entire tribe of Levi, who, after the incident of the golden calf, take up arms against their fellow Israelites to defend the faith. And even as late as the period of the Talmud, it was a well-known fact that Kohanim, priests, the descendants of Levi, were quick-tempered people with a chip on their shoulder. So given that the tribe seemed to take after their founders' personalities and follow in their footsteps, following this principle of Ma'aseh Avos Siman Levanim, the acts of the parents are a sign for the children, a cursory read of this parsha would tell me to expect that Yosef is going to be the tribe of kingship, that his descendants, Ephraim or possibly Manasseh, will be the future leaders of the Israelite nation. Of all the children of Yaakov, Yosef is the most obvious leader. He's handsome, he's wise, he's his father's favorite. He's a dreamer with prophetic insight, whose dreams tell him that he is destined for greatness. And if Yosef's brothers hate him and throw him into a pit because they think he's arrogant, they think he's pretentious, they don't like that he's a tattletale, the violence of their action only makes Yosef seem more noble by comparison. He's known as Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the Righteous, primarily because of the incident when he resisted the sexual advances of his wife at the price of his own freedom and good. Given that Yosef seems to be something of a wunderkind, the golden child in the family, the light among his brothers, and given that in his lifetime he does rule over his brothers, I would expect, following Ma'aseh Avot Siman Levanim, that Yosef's descendants would be the tribe of kingship. And while it's true that there was, for a good number of years during the period of the two kingdoms, a kingdom in northern Israel led by the tribe of Ephraim, one of Yosef's sons, that kingdom was really the sidebar to the primary thrust of Jewish history in the kingdom of Yehudah. And ultimately, the northern kingdom led by Yosef disappears from the stage of Jewish history. Instead, as foretold in Jacob's deathbed blessing, leadership in the form of the Davidic dynasty comes from the tribe of Yehudah, not Yosef. Yosef might have gotten a double portion of inheritance, but his descendants are not the true kings, and he is not the ancestor of the Messiah. Why is it that Yehudah and not Yosef, whose descendants merit the crown? Why is it that the tribe of Yehudah still survives in us today? We're called Yehudim because we came from the kingdom of Judah, Yehudah, while the heirs of Yosef the righteous have disappeared from the stage of Jewish history. Yehudah did not at first seem a likely candidate to take the mantle of kingship. He was the fourth son out of 12, firstborn, nor was he the favorite. That was Yosef. Firstborn, nor was he the favorite. That was Yosef. Nor is Yehudah a particularly effective leader in the beginning. When the brothers conspire to kill Yosef, Yehudah doesn't approve of their plan, but rather than standing up to them directly or convincing them not to harm Yosef, he proposes a compromise position where they sell Yosef into slavery. And while the brothers listen to him, it doesn't seem that listening to Yehudah in this case was such a good thing. Being sold into slavery rather than being killed seems to be a little bit of a frying pan and fire kind of a situation. And indeed, this decision by Yehudah to go for the low-hanging fruit of selling Yosef into slavery rather than trying to set him free entirely precipitates a fall from grace for Yehudah. Right after Yosef's sale into slavery, we read that Yehudah went down from his brothers. Vayered Yehudah me'et Echav. Rashi explains that this does not refer merely to a geographic relocation to a place of lower elevation, but that Yehudah's brothers deposed him from his previously elevated status in their ranks. Rashi says, Horiduhu Echav migdulaso. They took him down a peg from his greatness. And this was in retaliation for his failure to stand up for Yosef. They said, you told us to sell him. If you'd said return him to his home, we would have listened to you. This is Rashi's commentary. Because at that point, Yehudah's three older brothers have all disqualified themselves from leadership with poor judgment and violent impetuousness. Reuven disqualified himself by sleeping with his father's concubine, his own stepmother. Shimon and Levi by massacring the people of Shechem. So Yehudah would seem to be the next in line. But in this instant, he demonstrates that he's too blundering and venal to be an effective leader. His first disqualification is the fact that he is the one who suggests selling Yosef into slavery. And even if we want to read that in the most charitable light possible and assume that, like his older brother Reuven, Yehudah was just trying to save Yosef's life, we have to ask why he wasn't able to stand up to the brothers directly. And then if that wasn't bad enough, once he's deposed from his station by his brothers, he goes off and marries a Canaanite woman, a member of the nation of Canaan, which embodies immorality and idolatry. And then, when Yehudah's two older children die childless because of displeasing God, he sends his his youngest son, the brother of her two deceased husbands, and also bound to, in a certain sense, that young risk a third son dying, sends her away where she presumably is going to live out her days as a widow. But Tamar takes matters into her own hand, poses as a prostitute to get the recently widowed Yehudah to lie with her, and she becomes pregnant. And if Yehudah wasn't looking bad enough already, when he hears that his daughter-in-law, who he doesn't realize is the supposed prostitute that he slept with, when he hears that she is pregnant, for her crime of adultery. He wouldn't let her marry the son, but he considered them married enough that to be with anyone else should have been a capital offense. So nothing in Yehudah's actions at this point makes him seem fit to be a leader. Far from it. But something happens to him at this point which will ultimately put him in a position to be the leader among his brothers and demonstrate that he has what it takes to be the leader, the king. After Tamar is outed and Yehudah demands her execution, she secretly sends him proof that he is the father of her child. And at that point, Yehudah does perhaps the first noble thing that we've seen him do. Perhaps the first noble thing he's done in his whole life. He publicly acknowledges his guilt and Tamar's righteousness. The first trait of a true leader is not guiltlessness, but the ability to admit fault. This trait is actually hinted at in Yehudah's name. His mother gave him the name Yehudah because when he was born, she gave thanks to God. But the Hebrew word to give thanks shares a root with the word for confess, lehitvadot, to admit fault. The conceptual link between them is this idea of acknowledging. When I give thanks, I acknowledge a good that I have received. And when I confess, I acknowledge something that I have done. So there's an element of prophecy in names. And his name is not just an expression of his mother, Leah's gratitude, but a hint that he was destined to sanctify God by admitting his faults and accepting responsibility for his actions. And the rabbis actually contrast Yehudah's sanctification of God's name by admitting fault with that of Yosef, Hatzadik, who sanctified God's name by refusing the advantages of Potiphar's wife. And the rabbis point out that while Yosef sanctified God's name in private, Yehudah sanctified it in public. And this is reflected in the fact that Yosef's name does not contain any explicit mention of God's name. His name means increase, Yosef. But once in the book of Psalms, he's referred to as Yehoseph, with an extra hey added, which that now means that he has God's name in his name. Yod-Hey is one of the names of God. While Yehudah has God's name explicitly in his name. All four letters, Yod-Hey, Vav-Hey, are right there. And the rabbis seem to be saying that that Yehudah's sanctification of God's name was so much preferable to Yosef's that he deserves having God's name within his own. And this is surprising because it means that admitting guilt, which means you had to have done something wrong, is actually better than not doing something wrong in the first place. Or it's a stronger sanctification of God's name than refraining from wrongdoing in the first place. Obviously, when presented with the opportunity of doing wrong, we shouldn't do wrong. But the courage to admit it when we did do wrong is actually greater than the courage to refrain from doing wrong in the first place. This is not the only trait by which Yehudah demonstrates his fitness for leadership. We'll hear more about Yehudah's leadership in the parshiot to come. But I want to leave us here with this thought about leadership. We very often free from sin, who are guiltless, who are tzaddikim. And we would rather have a leader who's never done wrong than a leader who we know they've done wrong, they've made mistakes, and they've admitted it. But the truth is, real Yosefs, who refrain from sin at all time, are very rare. 99.999% of us, we're Yehudahs. We make mistakes. We do the wrong thing. But if we can be like Yehudah and own our mistakes and admit our mistakes, that's the kind of leader that the world needs. And so not only in selecting our leadership, should we look for people who can admit responsibility for their actions, admit what they've done wrong, over people who claim to be perfectly righteous. In our own lives, none of us is really a Yosef. Okay, maybe one person out of 10,000, out of 1,000,000 is a Yosef. I doubt it though, if it's even that many. But for the rest of us, we do things that are wrong. And we walk through our lives wanting to pretend we're Yosef, when in order to come into our full power as human beings, come into our heritage as descendants of Yehudah, and any potential for leadership among our peers, we have to be able to acknowledge our wrongdoing and our shortcomings. So as we go into this Shabbat of Hanukkah, and we kindle the lights in the midst of darkness, let's each bring a little light to the darkness in the world by shining light for ourselves, not necessarily broadcasting the whole world, but at least acknowledging between ourselves and God, if not publicly, when we've contributed to the darkness. And the very acknowledgement of our own shortcomings, our own contributions to the darkness, is in and of itself the light that will bring more light to the world with it, like the lights of the Chanukiah. Each light brings another, so that the light increases. And like the lights of the Chanukiah, the little bit of light of just acknowledging wrongdoing